Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I leave the game store and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. I just dropped my son off for his D&D game at the local game store, and I'm now walking home. I thought I would take a few minutes to chat with you. I was thinking about it, and I hadn't done one of my favorite weird episodes in a while, and this is the Geek Asks. For those of you new to the podcast, the Geek Asks is an episode where I, in all of my arrogance, pretend that the Board Game Geek forums are in fact an advice column in which I have been requested to give advice to people asking questions in the Board Game Geek forums. So what I do is I open up the Board Game Geek forums, I look at the recent posts, and then I just answer questions based on the subject line of the post. I don't read every post because a lot of them can't translate into clear questions or things that seem like they need inquiry, but hopefully there'll be enough that this is amusing. When I create the show notes for this episode, if you go to rattleboxgames.com and click on podcasts and then this episode, you will find links to each of the forums where this advice is aimed and find out whether or not it was at all relevant. Of course, I don't go post this advice here. Let's jump in. All right. Help. Please tell me more about this mini. I would say you're in the right place. Generally, if you want to know more about a mini, going to Board Game Geek is going to be the thing that you need. Setting history versus real life history. I don't know what that means. Expansions for Relic, impossible to find? Now this is an interesting problem that plagues all of us when we discover a game that is older, is that expansions for games generally have a much smaller print run and are very difficult to find once the game has sort of reached its life cycle. Now some games where the selling of the expansion is the whole of the game, like Arkham Horror, the card game, will intentionally keep all the expansions in print or as much as possible. A lot of other board games, however, they don't keep the expansions in print unless the game itself is maintained in print. So for example, if you wanted to go buy Seven Wonders, they've slowly released the expansions for the updated edition of Seven Wonders over the last couple years. All of those are generally kept in print because the base game is in print. But if the base game is not, then they generally don't keep the expansions in print. Relic, which is based on, I believe it's a sort of fantasy version of Talisman, or a sci-fi version of Talisman, is out of print as far as I understand it, which means that the expansions for it are pretty hard to find and probably more expensive than the expansions than the base game is, just because there's fewer copies of them. So yes, expansions are difficult to get, and if you want an expansion for a game and you aren't sure the game is an evergreen, probably get the expansion as soon as you can. Okay, lots of auctions today. Brainstorming to find a name of a board gaming event. Ooh, that's fun. Let's see if we can come up with a few. I'm gonna do 5 and then we'll quit. We'll call it Dice Thunder. That would be a fun one. Chits and Giggles. That would be a war game event designed around funny things, perhaps. How about, I think Power to the Meeple is already a board game channel, so that one won't work. Play cool games, win cool prizes. That's more of a slogan than an event name. Tabletop-ageddon, free reroll. That's 5. It's interesting to think about, like, what is the character of a board game event that you're naming? I think part of it depends on, is it a event you want people to be lured into if they don't know board gaming or don't know your event? For example, Toggle Top Day is the name of our tabletop day event that we hold for Toggle. It's probably not going to lure in a lot of people who don't already know the Toggle event is a tabletop board gaming event. But whatever. Can you suggest games where you can walk in rooms on a big board? The on a big board is the tricky part. So I presume this is a person who's looking for something kind of like Clue, where you can walk into rooms. I mean, I would say the best one here would be Mansions of Madness, which takes place in the Arkham Files world. But it doesn't use a board so much as a series of tiles that you put together to make a board. But generally that one has a big board you put together at the beginning, and it is the board you use for the whole game. So you have a kind of a sense of scope of the board before you get to do it. I would say another one that I'd point to is Last Night on Earth, the zombie game. This one has a bunch of buildings spread out over a town, and the different rooms in the buildings are rooms that you can walk into. I feel like that works pretty well to meet the criteria they're asking for here of rooms where you can, games where you can walk in a room on a big board. I mean, Betrayal at House on the Hill also feels like it would meet that requirement, except it's a series of tiles, not a big board. I'm not sure why they want specifically a big board, but that feels like the tricky part there. Inventions, Evolution of Ideas, Lacerda Group Buy from Australia. I think group buys are a great idea. I did that for a number of games that allows you to save money on shipping. Generally, if the game is large, I can't see how it saves them money on shipping, but it does. Maybe it saves them money on handling because they have one less order to handle. My best version of my group buy, I did a group buy for the game Australia, the Martin Wallace game. And I believe we ended up ordering 6 copies at a significant discount, $10 or $15 per person. Was not nothing. So I wonder if they do that. Okay. Not seeing a lot here that look like questions. Lower weight games that are good for 5 to 6 players. Great question, random person. Actually, the name of the person asking it is Neil. Well, Neil, I have lots of suggestions for you. The top choice for me would be Ink and Gold. I think Ink and Gold is an excellent game that allows for 5 to 6 players to have a great time. It's low stakes. You get 5 rounds of fun. If you're not looking for a trivia game or a strictly party game, Ink and Gold is top notch. If you were looking for a couple others, I mean, if you wanted to give people a weird experience, Just One is really fun, and So Clover if they are a little bit more puzzle-minded. Each of those has some real benefits and joy for 5 to 6 players. If you can go a little bit heavier, but not too much, I think Lords of Waterdeep works really well at 5 to 6. You may have to get the Scoundrels of Skullport expansion to play 6. I'm not sure. I know it plays 5. That one is a little heavier than your lightweight games, but Neil wrote lower weight, not lightweight. And so lower weight to me says you don't want a Vital Lacerda game. You don't maybe even Everdell is too much, but you're looking for something on that entry level, but not necessarily featherweight. I'd also say if you're looking for something short, Point Salad is really good. Easy to understand, quick to teach, plays in about half an hour with 6 people, maybe 45 minutes, depending if people are spending a lot of time thinking. It could go faster. If you want just a notch up in difficulty, Libertalia is great for 5 to 6 players. So that's a bunch of games I've just recommended that aren't party games. What kind of board game cafe would you like? This is an interesting question because I find a board game cafe is not a thing I really care for. And here's why. A board game meetup event like Toggle Gaming, we do at the bar where we meet. If there were a board game cafe that had a board game meetup like that, I would be all for it. But I think most board game cafes actually cater to groups that have come in together who want to play games together. And in that case, unless I'm traveling, a board game cafe doesn't offer me anything. If I have a group that I already have together, we'll just play at somebody's house. Going to a board game cafe so that I can pay either for the food and beverage or just pay to rent the table space and then play around a bunch of people that I'm not interacting with, I don't really find that an interesting or exciting experience. Now, if I'm in another city, my wife and I just want to we're touring for the day and we did our morning travel and we're just resting for a couple hours, going to a board game cafe, playing a couple light games from their collection. That is the sort of thing I would want. In which case I'd want a robust collection of games in the 15 to 60 minute window. I don't like having to pay for a table. I'd rather pay for food. If you have a food and beverage minimum, that's fine with me usually. Or even if there's a table cost, which you then get as a credit toward the food and beverage minimum, I don't have a problem with that either. That maybe even is better because then if you don't feel like buying anything, you could just pay to rent the table. Yeah, it's nice to have game teachers there. So if you want to try a new game, there's somebody who can come and teach it to you. You know, Snakes and Lattes has kind of got this system down pat, and I would say that's probably the place to go. So that's the kind of board game cafe I would like. Would a board game's graphics routed in a pixel art aesthetic be accepted? Absolutely. Maybe they mean rooted, not routed. It's R-O-U-T-E-D, which suggests some sort of path. I think if they said rooted, the sentence would make more sense. So I'm going to assume they just made a misspelling. I would say yes, in the abstract. This is a thing that has happened a number of times. Boss Monster famously used it. Pixel Lincoln, which is not a game I've played, but presumably uses pixel art. In fact, the follow-up games for Boss Monster also used pixelized art. So this is not a thing that's unheard of. That said, I would not want it except in a game where that is sort of very specifically the aesthetic they're going for. In Boss Monster, you really are trying to sort of replicate the NES style video game look. If you have another game that's not doing that actively, I wouldn't want pixel art. I don't find it really charming or anything. Did you prefer it when digital games were low res and faithful recreations of the original? That second half, I read this thread earlier, so I'm returning to a thing I've read before. That second half is not very well explained, but I think what they mean is in some newer iterations of online or digital versions of games, the animations and other things that happen when you interact with the game look and feel different than the physical components. Whereas some games, they just represent the physical components of the game and you interact with them as you would on the table. Of course, like Tabletop Simulator does this directly, and I think Tabletopia usually does as well. Oh, there's a children's party. We're having some sadness there. That you might interact with pieces just like you would on the table. I think that's what this person's talking about. They're also speaking, I think, about, like on Board Game Arena, they often take components of the game and refigure them to work better on the screen. So for instance, the scoreboard from Ark Nova is not represented in the same way on the screen, in part because they don't want to put this long, thin game board on the screen. It works well as a physical object on the table, but on the screen it looks weird. And so they've changed how that score works. And there's a number of things like that where the game displays different things for you than the physical experience does. I prefer for a game to work with the affordances of its medium. So I prefer for the game experience to be as close as possible, but if it works better to change the interface or change the look of something to make it easier to play online, they should do that. And anytime there's like an animation element, I like it. The one thing I wish games had more of, and they're doing this more and more, but I think even more would be better, is checking to make sure that you want to do what you did. I really like when the game says, "Are you sure?" Confirm your whole turn. Even just a confirm your whole turn at the end of the thing, or if you click something where it's about to make it so you can't go back, it should say, "Are you sure about your current turn up till this point? You can't go back once you've done this." And then every other thing should be able to go back. So, well, there's some stickers for you, or there's some advice for you based on the Board Game Geek forums. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.